Good morning and welcome to class 26 of Developmental Psychology, Psych 250 in the summer 2017 NDSU term. So it's our last week of class. I'm really sad, actually. This has flown by these 8 weeks, and I've really enjoyed getting to know all of you better through your discussion boards, through class emailing with you, through hangouts that we've done on Google. It's been really fun. I've really enjoyed getting to know you all and getting to work with you, and I'm very impressed with the work that you've done so far. Um, just looking ahead, I want to kind of go over what we're doing the rest of the week. Today we're covering psychological well-being in adulthood, and then we'll segue into romantic relationships, marriage, and family life in adulthood, and then our final lecture will be death, dying, and bereavement, so end of life. So Monday through Wednesday we'll be our having lectures. And then your quiz will be available on Wednesday. And the quiz covers last week's classes and this week's classes. And the quiz is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. So different. It's not due Monday, it's due Friday because that's the last day of class and I'll have your grades submitted by Monday. On Wednesday the 26th, your essay is due for your project. I've already seen 3 essays, so very good. So you are more than welcome to submit early if you're done with it. Go ahead and submit it. That'll help me out a lot. I can kind of get them graded as they come in, and so I don't have to be doing this again, like doing this all of this on Friday when I'm trying to load my U-Haul trailer. Um, let's see, and then Thursday it says on the syllabus Project Workday 2 on campus. We're not doing an on-campus meeting. What I'll do is Wednesday I will grade everybody's essay, but you will not see your grade. I'll just fill out the rubric. And then on Wednesday night I will email all of you a classmate's paper and you'll have to do a peer review. And I've posted instructions on the blackboard. I think it's in part 4 and 5 folder. Let me look. I'll confirm that for you. Yeah, and that's not available yet. It'll be available on Wednesday at midnight. So in that folder, there are instructions for peer review. Essentially, you just need to read the paper as if you were grading it, and you need to mark the rubric and what grade you would give them. And then you'll do that on Thursday, and then you'll need to email that back to me by midnight on Thursday. And I will then send each of you your paper back with your peers' notes and my notes. But I'm not going to tell you which is which. So you're just going to have to be like trying to figure out what's the best course of action. Now, the grade that you get if you submit on Wednesday will be your grade unless you decide to revise and resubmit based on the feedback you received. If you do that, you'll need to get that back to me by Saturday at midnight, and I will regrade it based on your second attempt. And if you do that, then you'll get, I think, 2 bonus points in addition to maybe potentially getting a better grade. You don't have to do that though. If you get good feedback on the paper, then you don't have to revise it. This is just for you if you feel like you could have done better or your peers thought you could do better. If you got both of your peer reviews were a perfect score. So my review, I gave you a perfect score and your peer gave you a perfect score, I'll just give you 2 extra credit points for doing such a good job. And then Friday, our final exam, not on campus. It says on the syllabus it's on campus. It's still online, just like the midterm. The exam will be available I guess Friday morning at midnight until Friday evening at 11:59 p.m. So take care of that. Remember that you've got to do that and your quiz both by 11:59 p.m. So my recommendation is Wednesday after you submit your essay, do your quiz. And then you don't have to stress out about having to do that on the exam. There's a lot of little things that have to be done at the end of this week, so I understand. I'll be as flexible as I can be. Um, if you can get your essays to me though quickly, like if you can get them to me before the due date, that would be amazing. So like if you already have them done, don't wait to submit them. Just go ahead and submit them. But there's no pressure. If you need until Wednesday, you can have until Wednesday. It would just be very helpful to me to not have to grade everything on Wednesday, because remember, I'm moving this weekend, so I'm trying to reduce the amount of things that I have to do. Um, Begging the question, why did I assign a project the last week? I don't know. Let's see. Friday also is the deadline for the Safe Zone extra credit, the movie extra credit. So if you did any of the movies, make sure you get your discussion boards in. Nobody's let me know that they're wanting to do the other movies, so I haven't put questions up. But if you do want to do them, please email me and I'll put the questions up. I just don't want to do work if it's not necessary. Um, Sona, it says on the syllabus August 6th is the last day to do Sona. That's not true because I have to get your grades in by the 31st because that's the day that I no longer work here. So if you can finish Sona on Friday and then email me and let me know how many Sona points you got. Um, it'll be honor system. I trust you all. You're all have been very reliable, so I have no qualms about doing that. If you weren't able to do any Sona, there was an essay opportunity that I posted about. Um, just go back through the announcements and look for it. I think the subject is extra credit Sona and movie nights. Under Sona alternative, there's a description that's due Saturday at midnight. Um, so I'll give you the 10 points if you do that. Um, so just let me know what you plan to do. So Sona is due by Saturday, or the Sona alternative is due by Saturday at midnight. And then Monday the 31st is my last official day here. I will by Sunday have your final grade posted to Blackboard. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you need to email me immediately so that I can look into it. Because Monday I am getting up, I am checking out of my apartment at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm coming to campus to unenroll. Once I unenroll or withdraw from school, I don't know how much access I'm going to have to things. So I'm going to put your grade in sometime between checking out of my apartment and withdrawing from school. And I'm planning on leaving Fargo about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, that being said, you need to be on if you have any questions about your grade, you're going to need to get those to me as soon as possible. So you will have your final grade posted and ready to go by Monday the 31st. All right. That's a lot, but it's a lot. There's a lot going on this week. Now, the last three lectures are short lectures, so we may be together the next 3 days for 50 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on how much material there is. I decided not to combine them into a single lecture because I think that a lot of you enjoy like the shorter lectures. I definitely do. The 80 to 70 to 80 minute lectures have been exhausting for me. I do appreciate you bearing with sort of on our compressed schedule this summer. You completed an 8-week class in 7 weeks. I mean, that's a huge accomplishment. So our classes this week are going to be shorter, and so that's good. And I encourage you, if you are used to spending 70 to 90 minutes on this class every day, I encourage you to take the rest of that time to work on your essays so that they can be as perfect as possible. Um, Today, so obligatory Star Wars meme. I love Star Wars. I've been watching Star Wars while I've been packing over the weekend, and I like this one. It typifies where I am right now. No stress. No, that's a phrase I haven't heard in a long time. It's my best Obi-Wan. I don't do Obi-Wan Kenobi. I do a good Chewbacca. I can't decide if I'm going to do it because I don't know if I want it on YouTube because I can see it being turned into something viral. But yes, I started packing my home office on Saturday, and my house is now a disaster area. So I totally get this. And today's topic is very pertinent to what I'm experiencing right now because it's psychological well-being in adulthood. So we're talking a lot about stress and depression. And of course, there's a mistake on the first slide. I've been doing really well. I've been like double reading everything, but I guess I'm excused because it's been a crazy last couple of days. Okay. So right off the bat, I'm going to ask you to do your discussion board. And what I would like for you to do is to pause the video and do the discussion board before you watch the rest of it. So my question for you is, what is the biggest stressor of adulthood? So take a minute, pause the video, and go do this on the discussion board. We talked a lot about the last couple of days about how early adulthood, emerging adulthood, young adulthood is sort of a period of great change where you are seeking intimacy and trying to avoid isolation, where you're trying to figure out your career, trying to figure out who you are. It's a very tumultuous time, and it's supposed to be. The reality is, nobody knows who they are, and nobody knows what they want until their mid 20s to late 30s. And even then, you still are learning new things every day, and you may be confused about what you. I mean, it's not accurate to say that anybody knows exactly who they are, exactly what they want at any point in their life. And during this period, this of early adulthood and emerging adulthood, when you're in your late teens to mid to late 30s, you're in this pretty volatile time period where there's a lot of transition. And the biggest transition that occurs in early adulthood is leaving home. You leave your parents to go to college. You may live with your parents in college, but then after college is over, you'll leave to go to a job. At the end of my undergrad, I was 23. I left home. I moved 1,400 miles away to Fargo, North Dakota. And it's a big transition. You go from being surrounded by the familiar and being in a safe environment, probably, it depends on your relationship with your parents, I guess, to one where you may not have the same support system. You may not have the same history. It may be harder for you to adjust to living in this new place. This transition often results in intense loneliness. Loneliness defined as unhappiness resulting from the gap between relationships we value and those we desire. In other words, we say you want to have a partner, and that's very important to you, but you don't have it. And so that gap, that desire to have a relationship, and you really care about having that relationship, but not having it, that gap can result in loneliness. It's just unhappiness at feeling like you don't belong anywhere, that you don't have what you want. Loneliness peaks in early adulthood, so it's at its worst right now for many of us, and it starts to decline in the 30s. So by then, most people have a relationship, their primary relationships, they have their support systems, they have a better idea of who they are and their place in the world and where they belong and where they fit in. So it can be much easier for them to deal with loneliness. Now, this is, like I said, a very volatile state. And so young adults who do leave home often return at least once after leaving. So um, I moved back in with my parents for 30 days before I moved here because I broke up with a partner. I'm going to be living with them for a couple weeks when I move back to Alabama because my stuff will take a while to get here and I don't want to sleep on the floor of a house. With like a toothbrush and all the things that I packed in my car. So, a lot of times young adults will return home. Sometimes it's because of the financial situation, role changes. So, like for me, I'm living with my parents because my role's changed. I'm, starting a new job, and there's a gap between when my stuff gets here or leaves here and gets there. High cost of living and low wages. We live in a time when people are not paid what they're worth, and they're not paid a living wage, but it costs a lot. And so sometimes it's more cost efficient to live with your parents. I actually have a friend, not had, have a friend who just last week moved out of her mom's home, and she is my age, and she actually intentionally moved in with her mother because her parents got divorced and her mother was living by herself and in the house, and she said, "Look, I'll come live at home with you, and I'll help you with the house, and I'll cook for you because mom didn't like to cook." And they're roommates, and they enjoyed that. I mean, she paid rent, obviously, it wasn't like she was getting a free meal. She just lived with her mom because she wanted to. And so, like, that could also happen. We talked a couple weeks ago about the psychological well-being of adolescents and how depression and anxiety are incredibly high for adolescents, and this trend tends to carry forward to the mid until the mid to late 20s. So you're pretty much going to be the same. If you're really depressed as an adolescent, you're probably going to have issues with depression in your early adulthood. It starts to go down in the late 20s, and you start to feel a lot better, and you don't have as many mental health issues in your 30s. But then in late middle adulthood, so towards the 50s and 60s, you start to experience depression again. And a lot of that has to do with role changes. So in adolescence, you're changing from a child to an adult, your responsibilities increase. In the 20s and 30s, early 20s, late 20s, you're in school, you're having a lot of role changes, a lot of identity changes, you're becoming the person you want to be. By your 30s, you're kind of established in your career with your family, you're doing well, and so things start to get better. And then in your late 50s, early 60s, you start to have another role change. You're starting to get close to retirement. Your body is making intense changes. And so for a lot of people that can also be very stressful or very depressing. Now stress, on the other hand, is highest for adults 25 to 59, and boy do I believe it. And women report much more stress than men. And for early adults, so people my age, 25 to um, 40, the stressors tend to be relationships, school, and work. So having one, not having one, having school, not finishing school, and then the stresses of starting work. In middle adulthood, so 40 to 60, it's the changing parent-child relationships and end of working life that are the biggest stressors. And it can be hard going from being the parent with a lot of control over your child to giving up a lot of autonomy to your child, and then seeing your child go off to college and becoming an adult. My parents flipped out when I went to college, and that was before I came out. They had a hard time adjusting to that, to adjusting to not being in charge of my life anymore, because you get so used to and so accustomed to micromanaging your child and making sure they're okay and that they have everything that they need, and then suddenly you don't have that role anymore, and that can be hard for a lot of parents to adapt to. In terms of this changing dynamic, it shifts in two ways for middle-aged adults during middle adulthood. Excuse me. I probably should be drinking water. First, if you're a middle adult, your children are transitioning often into early adulthood or to adolescence, depending on how late you had children. That's a huge transition, and that's very hard. But on the other side, you watch your parents transition to late adulthood. So there are two separate roles. This is called the sandwich generation because middle-aged adults have to care for the generation above and below them. And watching or taking care of aging parents is a very big stressor. Uh, your parents start to lose their mobility and independence as they get older, and that can be really devastating because we look to our parents as a source of strength and stability. And then suddenly they aren't that source of strength and stability anymore. You are, and that can be really anxiety provoking. And as a result, a lot of women quit their jobs to care for their parents. I had a professor in undergrad who was a lecturer, so not even a professor, just a lecturer, not doing any research, no job stability, just hired part time each semester to teach a certain number of classes. And she had gotten a degree in clinical psychology, was on a tenure track, and her mom got cancer, and she quit her job. She gave up her tenure track position to take care of her mom, and now she works as a lecturer. And so that happens a lot. Women will give up their jobs to take care of their parents because their brothers won't do it, or their husband can't do it, or won't do it. So that can be a big stressor, and can also be a huge damage to a person's identity if they care about their job. Now, a big stressor for people in late adulthood is the loss of autonomy. Um, and there's this sort of conflict between control versus dependency. And how much control we give our elders really determines their overall psychological well being. People do not like to give up control over their lives, especially if you've lived 60, 70, 80, or 90 years of your life being pretty much in charge, doing what you want to do, going where you want to go. Giving that up and being dependent on someone else can be really hard. Now, when we interact with older adults, we tend to follow two very predictable scripts. The first is the dependency support script, and that's where we attend to dependent behaviors immediately. So, for example, um, like your parent struggles to get to the bathroom or to get up. Let's not even use the bathroom. Let's just say get out of the chair. They can still do it, but it takes a lot longer for them to do it. So dependency support script would be us immediately when you see them starting to get up, helping them to get up. Instead of saying, "Mom, do you need help?" You just do it. You come in and you do it. You see it as a behavior that they can't do competently, and you rush in to help them immediately. The other is the independence ignore script, and that's when independent behaviors are ignored. So for example, if your mom is able to feed herself without assistance, you don't really pay attention to whether or not she's eating. You're just like, whatever. Um, Now, both of these scripts are very harmful because they reinforce dependency. So, for example, it's important for older adults to know or to feel like they have some control. So, always like rushing to help someone who's older can actually foster dependency, and then they start to give up a lot more autonomy because they're like, well, what's the point in even trying if Johnny's going to come help me? And so it's not, and I'm trying to be careful about how I say this because I don't want it to come across as, well, you just ignore their needs. That's not what it is. If they can do it, you let them do it. That's the message that you should get. The other is to just say, well, I'm not going to check and make sure my mom is eaten because I know she can feed herself. Um, that can also foster dependency, because you're reinforcing all the other behaviors that she does need help with, and so and also potentially like maybe she needs help but not getting it. And so a good way to work around that is, if mom can feed herself, just ask her, what'd you have for lunch today? And that's a good way to check in and see, hey, is mom eating today? Has she eaten today? Across the lifespan, but especially in middle adulthood to late adulthood, physical health and negative life events are a huge contributor to negative psychological well-being for older adults. Physical declines often foster late life depression, and depression in late adulthood is actually a really big deal. It's something we don't talk about a lot. But when you start to have a lot of health problems, you start to lose mobility, you start to lose independence, this really fosters a very vicious cycle, where you experience some kind of physical or emotional or social decline, and you go into depression, and then you give up, and then you start to decline even quicker. Because if our emotional, psychological, spiritual side gives up on us, then our physical side is just going to go down really fast. Because when we're depressed, we tend to not take care of ourselves as well. Negative life events sort of function in the same way as physical decline. So if your spouse dies, or you have a chronic illness, so a long-term illness or an acute illness, acute is a short-term illness that's serious. These can increase stressors, which can result in worsening depression. So getting pneumonia can be very life-threatening, and it can be very depressing, and it can send you into a sort of a depression, giving up, rapid decline spiral. For older adults, social support is very important. It's key to increasing longevity, reducing late life depression, and improving physical health. The problem, though, is social support is very hard for older adults to get um, because the world is rapidly changing. And so there are three different theories that explain why this happens. Why does the world of the older person change? Why is it hard for them to get social support? The first is the disengagement theory. I don't like this theory. I don't like the first two. This theory states that there's a mutual withdrawal between elderly adults and society in anticipation of death. In other words, older adults know they're dying, and so they kind of stop engaging in the world. It's sort of like when you come to the end of school or you come to the end of a job, you kind of stop giving your 100% because you're like, I'm going to be gone soon. I don't really care anymore. And that's what the disengagement theory states, is that we see this disconnect socially between older people and younger people because they know they're about to die. And so they're like, I'm not going to, maybe not right like in the next 2 days or so, but like I'm getting older, I'm going to die soon, so I'm not going to engage as much. I'm just going to kind of live in my own world because I don't want I don't want to invest anymore. I don't want to get attached to people. And it's mutual. So the younger people are doing the same thing. We're repelled by older people because they're about to die, and we don't want to have to deal with the emotional ramifications of that. The second is the activity theory, which states that older adults can't keep up physically. So they kind of, their social support systems disappear, the world changes around them, and they just kind of are not part of it anymore because they can't keep up. And I don't like that either, because I don't think older adults are unable to keep up. I think they they're not able to go at the same speed, but they can still keep up. Sometimes it's just psychologically, maybe not physically. I like the third theory the best, and this is the continuity theory. And this explains that older adults maintain a life that works best for them. In other words, this changing world, the changing social support systems, reflect what works for the older adult. So if you used to golf every day um, and you were very active and suddenly you can't do that anymore. So what you might do is say, well, what did I like about golfing? Well, I enjoyed like spending time with other people but not talking, or I enjoyed being outside and just experiencing the outdoors. Older adults would, according to the continuity theory, come up with something similar that gave them the similar experience. So if you like hanging out with people but not talking, maybe you join some kind of, maybe you go to the library and you read at the library so you're around other people but you're not talking to them. Maybe you like being outside, so you start going to the park and maybe you just sit in the park for a little bit and enjoy that. You're not doing the same thing that you were doing, but you're getting the same thing out of it. That's an example of what the continuity theory would state an adult would do as part of their changing world. One of the biggest changes that happens for older adults is the changes to their communities. And so this is actually a big one, and it's one we don't acknowledge. Really don't acknowledge any of this, to be honest. We ignore old people, which is our loss because older people are amazing. Some of my best friends are in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and I enjoy their company a lot more than I do younger people because they take me seriously and they have good advice, and I enjoy. I really like going to like Perkins and Frying Pan. I call it Frying Pan. I do it with a southern accent. I love Frying Pan. I like to go, and I'm looking forward to the day that I can order off the 55 plus menu because I feel left out. Um, but I really enjoy, like, the older adult lifestyle is so my speed. Like, I know I go all the time, but honestly, if I could just be, like, not interacting with a lot of people all the time and not being, like, super active and just doing the things that I like to do, oh my gosh, life would be amazing. The communities in which elderly adults live change with them and can cause a lot of stress. Um, you live in a neighborhood. A lot of times what happens is older adults live in neighborhoods that were once very safe and very prominent, but have really started to decay in a way, where you have newer neighborhoods with more families, and so suddenly you have this community or this neighborhood full of older people and maybe some younger people, but because it's declining, the property values are going down. Maybe you have a lot younger people coming in. Maybe you have undesirable people coming in. And this can be a big stressor to older couples. One, they lose a lot of their neighbors that they've known probably for a long time. Um, they there tends to be a fear that crime is going to increase. Whether or not it does or not, remains to be seen. But a lot of times we perceive, well, if people of a lower social class are moving in, there's going to be crime. Um, watched this happen in my grandmother's neighborhood, great grandmother's neighborhood. It was a really nice subdivision at one point, and then it kind of slowly became. It went from being upper middle class to lower middle class, with some working class families moving in, and so there was some concern that there would be an increased crime. Didn't happen, but there was still that concern. And so that can be a huge thing. Um, Even going out into the community, older people are afraid of crime because they aren't able to protect themselves the way they used to. If they could get seriously hurt if attacked by someone in the street or if someone breaks into their home. Many older adults have to move into assisted living. That's just a unfortunate reality. Is if you live by yourself, or even if you live with your spouse but your spouse is getting old too, sometimes you have to live in an assisted living community where you still have a lot of independence, but you have someone there if you need them. And this is usually what happens when you can't afford to have someone come in during the day and clean and cook for you. There are some factors that improve the process of change within a community. The first is familiar settings. So finding a care option that resembles the familiar. So if you're looking for assisted living, look for something close by to where they live, or that's within the neighborhood where they shop or where their church is, so that they don't have like a huge amount of change. Like, for example, I had a person at my parents' church. Their parent got too old to live by themselves, and they moved them all like across the country to live in Auburn with their with them. They lived in an assisted living facility, but they moved them away from the town where they lived their whole life. Well, not their whole life, but their whole adult life. The church where they had friends, the community that they had friends in. That was a really stressful move for them because they lost everything, and it's hard to restart when you're 80 years old to make new friends, to integrate into a new church. That can be really hard. It can be scary. Fortunately for this woman, there was a very vibrant older adult community at that church, and they accepted her immediately, and it wasn't a big deal. But it can be a big deal. So ideally, you want to find something that resembles what they have the most. So if you can, try to find something in the same neighborhood, around the same stores. That's really big because then nothing really changes just where they live. Um, Letting them have as much of their things as possible is also really important. Obviously, if you're moving from a four-bedroom house to a one-bedroom assisted living apartment, I mean that will require downsizing, but like helping them pick stuff that's important to them, furniture, decorations that's important to them, so that they can still feel like they're at home. Um, Living in neighborhoods with people of the same age is also important. If you're the oldest person in your neighborhood, say you're like in your 70s and everyone in your neighborhood's like in their 20s and 30s, that can be isolating because you don't have people to hang out with. I mean, you think about our generation. We meet people online, we meet people at school, we meet people at work. But if you're older, if from your grandparents' generation, that's not how you met people. The internet didn't exist. You actually knew your neighbors. The people that you interacted with, the friends that you had were people in your neighborhood, people in the clubs that you belonged to, people at your church perhaps, or temple or mosque. Um, and so when you get older, if you're not, even if you're an older person and you're using the internet and you're using it as well as like teenagers are, you're still going to be in this mindset. I meet people that I live near, that I interact with. And so that can be hard if you live in a neighborhood with people who are younger than you. It's harder to sometimes find close friendships the way that you're accustomed to. So that can be very stress provoking. And then ideally, if you have to go into a nursing home or assisted living facility, you find something that focuses on assistance with autonomy. So in other words, you're not in a hospital setting, it's more of a residential setting where you receive like you have some help. That is the ideal. You want to try to avoid like what we think of as a nursing home, where it's kind of more of a hospital or medical setting, because that's no way to live. Like that that reduces a person's lifespan to being in that kind of situation. So you want to try to find something that is as autonomy building as possible, or I guess autonomy sustaining. One thing that we really don't talk about that we need to talk about more, which is why we're talking about it, is elder maltreatment. This happens more often than we would care to think about. And unfortunately, between 3 to 28% of elders are mistreated by their family, friends, or professional caregivers. And the rates are a lot higher for white elderly people. And the reason for this is that Native cultures, Latinx cultures, um, African American cultures have a very high respect for their elders, much higher than white populations, and traditionally are more likely to have them in the home with them as they age instead of putting them in a care home. That's just the way that it is. I don't know what it is about white culture that makes that different, that a distinction, but there is a marked difference in the way that communities of color treat their elders versus the way that we do. And the majority of this abuse that happens in care homes. Because the people caring for your loved ones in a care home don't really don't love them or care for them the same way that you do. There's always an exception to that. My great grandmother had a woman who would come in and take care of her during the day, and then someone else who'd come at night, and they both cared very deeply for her. But that's definitely an exception rather than a rule. Um, the types of maltreatment that elders experience are physical abuse. So it can be anything from being slapped or hit to being like jerked around. Um, a lot of times, what happens is like care people who are caring for them will like sort of yank them around when they're helping them get dressed or cleaning up after them. Um, Physical neglect is also really common. This is where you like maybe you let them sit, like if they have to wear a diaper, for example, letting them sit in their soiled diaper for a very long time, or not giving them a bath every day, or where their needs are not being met. Basically, you have to think of when people become so frail that you have to do things for them, you have to think of them as if they were a baby. Not treat them like a baby, but think of them as if they were a baby, and that you have to provide the same level of care. Emotional abuse is really common, and this is common no matter if the person is treated is abused by their professional caregiver, their family member, their friends. Emotional abuse is very high. This is telling them that they're a burden, yelling at them, fussing at them, making them feel bad because they're older and they can't do the things that they need to do, um, giving them a hard time, like, I had to give up my job to take care of you. That's emotional abuse. I mean, they're dependent on you. You can't make them feel bad for that. They have no other option. Um, Less common, thankfully, is sexual abuse, but it still happens, and I think it's disgusting and awful. It's disgusting and awful that it happens. Period. But an older person, really, I feel the same way about that. And with a child, it's like, really, they're vulnerable. That's just, it's bad regardless of how old the person is, but it's just there's something especially heinous about doing it to a vulnerable person. Um, Financial abuse, this happens a lot too. This is where you take advantage. There's a scam going around right now where someone's calling and pretending to be the IRS, and they say you're going to be arrested if you don't pay a fine. And older people fall for this. They don't know. And so they take people at their word a lot of the time, and so that's a financial abuse. If your mother or father is older and they've given you control of their finances, stealing money from them without telling them, well, I guess if you don't tell them it is stealing, but stealing money from them is financial abuse, and that happens a lot. So, a lot of the factors that contribute to maltreatment of elders are dependency of the victim. So, if the victim is very dependent upon a caregiver, that can be a risk factor. Not always. It doesn't mean that all highly dependent elders are going to be victimized. It just means there's a much greater likelihood if you are semi-dependent or completely, especially if you're completely dependent, of abuse occurring. Surprisingly enough, perpetrators who are dependent upon the victim, that perpetrators who are highly dependent also are at increased risk of perpetuating abuse. So if you are, say, a 40-year-old and you live with your 80-year-old mother and or 70-year-old mother, and you're highly dependent upon her financially, but she's dependent upon you physically, that could lead to abuse. Um, the psychological well-being of the perpetrator also is a huge risk factor. Um, the perpetrator being, remember, a caregiver. So if the caregiver has a lot of mental health issues and they're taking care of their parent or their another elderly person, that could put them at higher risk of abusing them. Not always, but it can. History of family violence. So if you grew up, this is pretty interesting. If you as an elderly you the elderly person, as a younger person, abuse someone who then becomes your caregiver, a lot of times they will repay that abuse by abusing you as an older person. That can happen. um, if you were an abused person and you're caring for someone, an elderly person who didn't abuse you, you could still be at increased likelihood. But a lot of times, what happens with a history of family violence is the perpetuator of the victimization of previous victimization, who is now elderly and dependent upon the person that they abused, that person who was abused by them will then return the abuse upon them. Um, Not okay. It's not okay. It wasn't okay before. It's not okay then either, or now either. And then institutional conditions are a huge risk factor. If you live in a nursing home or a care facility or assisted living facility where there's very little oversight, or there's very lax attention to the rules, that is a huge warning sign. If you go to a nursing home and you ask anybody and if you have a loved one in a nursing home and you ask anybody who works there about them and they don't know who they are or they can't tell you, that is a huge red flag, and you need to think about getting them out of there. That's how violence and abuse against older people happens. Is nobody is really aware that they're of what's going on with them. If you are a technician, a health technician, nurse's assistant, nurse, any kind of staff member at a nursing home where you're providing direct care, if you don't know what's going on with each of the people within your area of where you work, then you're not doing your job. You need to know everybody and what's going on with everybody, because the way abuse happens is, say you know you have a person who's elderly. So no, she doesn't look elderly, but pretend that she is. And they're only being taken care of by one person and not the entire team. This person could abuse them, and nobody would know it because no one else is checking in on them. So you want to have multiple people um, rotating and making sure that everybody's okay. So it's important. It's not necessarily that every nurse and every nurse assistant has to see every patient, but there should be multiple people interacting with everybody. And they should ideally be, as a team, talking about together in the nurse station what's going on with each person. Um, so if you go in and somebody on the floor who works on that floor doesn't know your loved one, you should be worried. You should ask other people. Don't just go off one person. Maybe they're new, maybe they're just not with it. But if multiple people don't know who you're talking about or they can't tell you how they're doing, then and you also should talk to your loved one and say, "Hey, have anybody? How many people have been to see you today? Like, are they treating you well?" And prevention is really important, and this is where loved ones are so important. You have to think of elders like children, not treat them like children. I want to emphasize you don't treat them like children, but you have to think of them like children because they're a vulnerable population. You have to listen to them, you have to listen to their complaints, and you have to take them seriously, even if it sounds far fetched, even if they're starting to show signs of dementia. You have to listen to their complaint. You have to take it seriously. Take it seriously, file a complaint, report concerns to social services, to the patient advocate or the resident advocate at the nursing home. Let them do an investigation. Maybe it was nothing, but you would rather it be nothing and waste people's time than it to be something and not do anything about it. And that's the thing to remember. Social services isn't just responsible for youth. They're responsible for older people. They're responsible for people with intellectual or physical disabilities. Anybody who needs the assistance who's a vulnerable population is under the purview of social services. You can call them and say, I'm concerned. You can fill out a report. You can download the form online. It's super easy. You report it to them. The burden is on them to figure out if it's true or not. All you have to do is report it. And it's very important to do that. Now, we talked a lot about older adults because I think probably the mental health is the worst for older adults because we ignore it and because it's all the risk factors for mental health issues are are even worse and even more prevalent in older adults than they are for younger adults and middle adults. But at all ages, it's important to use appropriate and effective coping for mental health distress. You want to make sure that at all ages you're doing something healthy to deal with your distress and not abusing alcohol or um, abusing drugs or spending a lot of money to cope or cutting yourself. I mean, that happens at all ages, unfortunately. Um, some different examples. Problem-centered coping is a very effective method. This is when you look at the problem and you try to come up with solutions for it. Emotion-centered coping, that's when you look at your emotions that you're experiencing and acknowledge that they're there and acknowledge what they're trying to tell you. Social support, seeking help from people who are similar in age to you, similar to experience, or even people who are older or younger. Well, younger, yes, but it's better to not lean on people who aren't mature enough. Now, if you're an 80-year-old leaning on someone who's 50 or 60 for help, for social support, isn't a big deal. You probably wouldn't want to burden your grandchild, like your 16-year-old grandchild with, your depression. But because they're probably not mature enough to deal with it. But if you have a daughter, an older grandchild who's like in their 20s or 30s, or a daughter or son or niece or nephew or cousin or someone, that would be appropriate. And then using community resources. There are resources available for older people. Social services provides a lot of supplementary income, food, um, heat here in North Dakota, which I think is cool. Social services pays for the heat of elderly people who can't afford it. Um, Cell phone. So knowing that those resources exist and using them to help is also important. All right. Next time for Class 27, we're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about romantic relationships, we're talking about marriage, and we're talking about family life. So to prepare for that, read pages 427 to 477, 479 to 492, 543 to 547, 552, 620 to 627. And I want you to think about this. What do you look for in a life partner? Remember, your project essays are due on Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. There are no due dates for now, so just keep writing and working on your essay and letting me know if you have questions, comments, or concerns by emailing me at darcy.corbetthall, CORBITTHALL, at ndsu.edu. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day.